Snowflakes usually bring joy, but in Oak Haven, they brought a whiteout of suffocating death. 72 people froze in their living rooms, while one eccentric outcast watched the deadly superstorm safely from his fortified cavern. They called him crazy. 7 days later, they were begging for his mercy. Arthur Pendleton was not a madman, though the 800 residents of Oak Haven, Colorado, had long ago decided otherwise. A former lead structural engineer for the Kiewit Corporation, Arthur had spent his career boring tunnels through unyielding granite and building subterranean infrastructure for the military. When he retired, he didn't buy a golf cart or a beach condo in Florida. Instead, he purchased 40 acres of steep, completely unarable limestone and granite cliff face on the northern edge of town, right at the base of Mount Silas. For 3 years, the town was forced to endure the relentless, grinding symphony of Arthur's retirement project. The heavy diesel hum of a rented Caterpillar 320 excavator echoed down the valley from dawn until dusk. Convoys of flatbed trucks from Home Depot and specialized industrial suppliers rumbled through Oak Haven's quiet main street, carrying pallets of Portland cement, high-grade steel rebar, industrial air scrubbers, and heavy-duty Generac commercial generators. At the local diner, Arthur became the sole punchline to every joke. "Pendleton's building a tomb for his ego," Mayor Richard Hayes would say, stirring his coffee while holding court in the center booth. Hayes was a pragmatic, image-obsessed politician who hated anything that disrupted the picturesque ski town aesthetic of Oak Haven. "The man is digging a hole into solid rock, says the grid is fragile, says the jet stream is destabilizing. I say he's got a few screws loose." Arthur rarely engaged. He was a widower in his late 60s, a man built like a fire hydrant, with thick, calloused hands and a permanent layer of stone dust in the creases of his jacket. He knew what he was doing. He had modeled the shifting meteorological data from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, for years. He saw the increasing volatility of the polar vortex, the sudden stratospheric warming events that were pushing Arctic air masses further south with unprecedented violence. He had survived the devastating Texas grid failure of 2021, watching his wife succumb to hypothermia when the power grids collapsed and the state froze. He had sworn to the cold, dead sky that he would never be vulnerable again. So, Arthur built his fortress. He bored 50 feet into the side of Mount Silas. He reinforced the cavern with a geodesic steel ribbing and sprayed shotcrete over the walls, sealing the living space from moisture and seismic shifts. He installed a closed-loop geothermal heating system, a hydroponic bay illuminated by timed LED grow lights, and a massive bank of Tesla Powerwalls connected to a concealed solar array on the southern ridge. The entrance was a repurposed, 6-inch-thick steel blast door he had acquired from a decommissioned silo auction, painted a matte gray to blend seamlessly with the mountain face. The town did everything they could to stop him. Mayor Hayes weaponized the zoning board, serving Arthur with endless cease and desist orders, claiming the excavation violated environmental impact statutes. Sheriff Boyd Jenkins, a towering man who preferred the path of least resistance, was frequently dispatched to Arthur's property to hand-deliver the fines. "Arthur, you can't keep blasting without a county permit," Sheriff Jenkins had warned him one crisp October afternoon, leaning against his Ford F-150. "The town council is going to put a lien on your property. People are getting tired of the noise, and frankly, the bunker is creeping everyone out." "It's not a bunker, Boyd," Arthur had replied, wiping grease from his hands with an old shop rack. "It's a sustainable subterranean dwelling, and they can fine me all they want. The paper those fines are printed on will make excellent kindling when the substations freeze. We live in Colorado, Arthur. We know how to handle snow. "You know how to handle winter," Arthur corrected, his eyes dark and serious. "You don't know how to handle an anomaly." The anomaly arrived on the second Tuesday of January. It didn't start with a dramatic clap of thunder or a sudden cinematic darkening of the sky. It started with an unnerving silence. The local weather stations predicted a standard winter squall, maybe 8 inches of accumulation over the weekend. But deep in the Pacific Northwest, a massive low-pressure system collided with a fractured lobe of the polar vortex that had plunged straight down the spine of the Rocky Mountains. By noon on Tuesday, the temperature in Oakhaven plummeted from a comfortable 35 degrees Fahrenheit to -12 in a matter of hours. The wind picked up, howling through the pines with a shrieking metallic pitch. Then the snow began to fall. It wasn't normal snow. It was a dense, heavy precipitation known as graupel, falling so thick and fast it created an immediate whiteout. Visibility dropped to 0. Within the first 6 hours, 3 feet of snow had blanketed the town. Interstate 70, the only major artery connecting Oakhaven to the rest of the state, was entirely buried beneath avalanches and jackknifed semi-trucks. The Colorado Department of Transportation pulled all their plows off the roads. It was essentially suicide to drive. In his cavern, Arthur Pendleton checked his digital barometers. The atmospheric pressure was dropping at a terrifying rate. He sealed the heavy blast door, engaged the 4 heavy steel deadbolts, and activated the internal air circulation system. The quiet hum of his geothermal pumps filled the warm, well-lit space. He brewed a cup of black coffee on his Coleman camp stove, saving battery power where he could, and sat down in front of his bank of security monitors. Outside, the town of Oakhaven was completely blind to the fact that they had just been cut off from the rest of human civilization. The 7-day blizzard had begun. By the 36th hour of the storm, the hubris of Oakhaven had shattered into absolute terror. The snow had not stopped for a single second. 7 feet of accumulation now pressed against the doors and first-story windows of the town's charming Victorian homes and modern A-frame cabins. The wind raged at a sustained 60 miles per hour, creating drifts that reached the power lines. The temperature outside, factoring in the wind chill, was a lethal -45 degrees. The first catastrophic failure occurred at the local Xcel Energy substation. The sheer weight of the ice and the violent winds snapped the main transmission lines. Transformers overloaded and blew in a spectacular shower of blue sparks, instantly muted by the blinding white storm. In a heartbeat, the entire town of Oakhaven went dark. Inside the homes, the cold immediately went to work. Without electricity, the central heating systems died. For a few hours, people huddled under blankets, lighting scented candles, and burning whatever firewood they had stacked by their hearths. But modern homes are not built to withstand Arctic temperatures without active heating. The cold seeped through the drywall, crept over the floorboards, and settled into the bones of the houses. Pipes froze and shattered. Basements flooded with water that turned to solid ice within minutes. Mayor Richard Hayes paced the floor of his luxury cabin, wrapped in 3 layers of heavy Carhartt gear. His breath plumed in the air of his own living room. His wife was sobbing quietly on the couch, entirely buried beneath a pile of down comforters. The backup generator he had purchased years ago had run for exactly 4 hours before the carburetor froze solid. He picked up his cell phone. No service. The cell towers on the ridge had either frozen or lost their backup power. The landlines were dead. Down in the valley, Sheriff Boyd Jenkins was fighting a losing battle. He had managed to reach the police station on a snowmobile before the engine seized. Using a hand-cranked emergency radio, he desperately tried to contact FEMA or the State National Guard. All he received was the endless hiss of static. People began to die on the 3rd night. It happened quietly, Elderly residents, unable to keep their core temperatures up, simply drifted into an unbreakable sleep. Families who tried to use propane grills indoors to stay warm succumbed to carbon monoxide poisoning, their silent deaths adding to the town's invisible toll. Sheriff Jenkins, realizing that isolated survival was impossible, had attempted to organize a mass evacuation to the high school gymnasium on the second day, hoping collective body heat and the school's commercial-grade backup generators would save them. About 200 residents had braved the deadly trek, tying themselves together with climbing ropes to avoid getting lost in the whiteout, just crossing the street. But the snow was too heavy. On the morning of the fourth day, the flat, expansive roof of the high school gymnasium groaned under the weight of 10 feet of densely packed ice and snow. The massive steel trusses buckled. Sheriff Jenkins screamed for everyone to run just seconds before the center of the roof caved in. The collapse didn't kill anyone, thanks to the warning, but it exposed the entire surviving population to the raging blizzard. The gymnasium was instantly filled with swirling, sub-zero winds. The generators were crushed. Panic erupted. Children were crying, their tears freezing to their cheeks. People were suffering from severe frostbite, their fingers and noses turning a waxy, dead white. "We can't stay here," shouted Sarah Miller, the owner of the local hardware store. She grabbed the sheriff's arm, her voice barely audible over the screaming wind. "We'll be dead in an hour. The wind chill is dropping." "Where do we go?" Jenkins roared back, his mustache caked in a thick layer of ice. "Every building in town is a freezer. The roads are gone." Sarah looked up toward the northern ridge, invisible behind the curtain of flying snow. "The mountain," she said, her voice shaking with a mixture of hope and profound dread. "Pendleton's place. He has geothermal heat. He has power. I saw the receipts for the equipment he bought. It's a goddamn fortress up there." Mayor Hayes, who had fled to the school with the others, pushed his way through the huddled crowd. His face was pale, his political arrogance entirely stripped away by the sheer, brutal reality of nature. "Arthur? The man is insane. He locked himself in. He won't open the door for us." "He's a human being," Sarah screamed. "It's a 2-mile hike up the incline. We take the logging trail. It's shielded by the trees. If we stay here, we die. If we try for his place, we might live." Jenkins didn't hesitate. He rallied the remaining able-bodied adults. They strapped on whatever snowshoes or cross-country skis they could salvage, carrying the children and supporting the elderly. The 2-mile journey up Mount Silas took 4 agonizing hours. The snow was chest-deep in places. They had to take turns breaking the trail, burning through calories and body heat at a lethal rate. 7 people didn't make it up the mountain. They collapsed in the snow, their bodies shutting down, and the survivors had no choice but to leave them behind, crying as the whiteout swallowed the fallen. Finally, navigating by memory and the jagged silhouette of the granite cliff, the desperate mob reached the northern ridge. Through the blinding snow, they saw it. A faint, warm, yellow glow emanating from a heavily reinforced security camera mounted above a sheer wall of rock. Beneath it was the grey steel blast door. Sheriff Jenkins stumbled forward, his legs numb, his lungs burning from the frigid air. He hammered his heavy, snow-caked gloves against the unyielding steel. The sound was dull, absorbed by the massive thickness of the door. "Arthur!" Jenkins screamed, his voice tearing his throat. "Arthur, it's Boyd! Open the door! We have children out here! We're dying!" Inside his brilliantly lit 72-degree sanctuary, Arthur Pendleton stood before his security monitors. He held a steaming mug of coffee. On the screen, rendered in high-definition infrared and night vision, he saw the thermal signatures of over 100 freezing, desperate people clustered against his door. He saw the mayor who had tried to bankrupt him. He saw the townsfolk who had spat at his feet and called him a doomsday lunatic. Arthur set his coffee down. He walked to the heavy steel locking mechanism of the blast door. He placed his hand on the primary deadbolt lever. But Arthur hesitated. The twist was not that Arthur was vindictive. He wasn't savoring their misery. The terrible, crushing reality was rooted in the very engineering he had perfected. Arthur looked at the digital readout on his wall. Occupancy rating, maximum 12 persons. Oxygen scrubber capacity, 15 persons for 30 days. He had designed the bunker for himself, his late wife, and perhaps a few extended family members who had never answered his calls. The ambient air filtration system, deeply buried and drawing from a concealed intake vent, could only scrub the carbon dioxide exhaled by a small group. If he let 150 panicked, hyperventilating people into the sealed environment, the CO2 levels would spike to toxic levels within 6 hours. If he kept the door closed, they would freeze to death on his doorstep in 30 minutes. If he opened the door, they would all suffocate together inside the mountain by morning. Outside, the pounding on the steel grew weaker. The desperate screams turned into ragged, dying wails. "Arthur, please!" Mayor Hayes's voice came through the external intercom system, reduced to a pathetic, weeping whisper. "I was wrong. I'm sorry. Please save my wife." Arthur closed his eyes, the weight of the mountain suddenly pressing down on his own chest. He grabbed his heavy insulated coat and a handheld thermal scanner. He had to make a choice, and he had to make it now. Arthur's hand hovered over the primary release lever. The digital readout on his environmental control panel blinked with absolute, unforgiving mathematics. He could not alter the physics of oxygen consumption, nor could he magically expand the chemical capacity of his lithium hydroxide scrubbers. If he let the entire town into the sealed living quarters, they would all die of hypoxia and carbon dioxide poisoning before dawn. It would be a mass grave, peaceful but terrifyingly final. But Arthur Pendleton was a master engineer, and engineers do not simply accept failure. They look for the bypass. He keyed the intercom, his voice booming over the external loudspeakers, cutting through the howling wind. "Listen to me. If you rush the door, you will doom us all. I am opening the outer equipment bay. Move inside, stay against the walls, and do exactly as I say." Arthur slammed his palm against the heavy green activation button. The hydraulic motors groaned, a deep mechanical roar that vibrated through the granite. Slowly, the massive steel blast door retracted, revealing a yawning, 40 by 60-foot subterranean cavern. This was the drift, the unheated, unfinished staging area Arthur had excavated for his heavy machinery, separated from his sealed, climate-controlled living quarters by a secondary inner airlock. The desperate mob of Oakhaven residents surged forward, driven by primal survival instincts. They spilled into the cavern, a tangle of snow-caked bodies, sobbing children, and shivering elders. As the last person dragged themselves across the threshold, Arthur hit the override. The outer door slammed shut, engaging the heavy steel deadbolts with a deafening clang. The roaring of the blizzard was instantly muted, replaced by the ragged, echoing sound of 143 people gasping for breath in the dark. Arthur stood atop a metal catwalk overlooking the bay, holding a high-lumen mag light and his thermal scanner. The ambient temperature of the subterranean rock was 54 degrees Fahrenheit. To a person sitting in a living room, it was chilly. To a crowd that had just spent 4 hours marching through negative 45-degree wind chill, it was a tropical paradise. "Arthur, let us into the main house," Mayor Richard Hayes yelled, his teeth chattering uncontrollably as he supported his wife, Brenda, who was barely conscious. It's freezing out here. You have heat in there. I have heat, and I have breathable air for exactly 15 people, Richard, Arthur barked back, his voice echoing off the raw shotcrete walls. He descended the metal stairs, wading into the exhausted crowd. This complex is a closed-loop system. The air scrubbers draw from a concealed intake on the ridge. If I open the inner doors to all of you, the carbon dioxide levels will reach toxic concentrations in less than 6 hours. You won't freeze. You'll just fall asleep and never wake up. A stunned silence fell over the cavern, broken only by quiet weeping. The absolute horror of their situation settled in. They were safe from the ice, but they were still balancing on the razor's edge of death. "We do triage right now," Arthur commanded, stepping into the role he was built for. He pointed the thermal scanner at the crowd. "Anyone with a core temperature under 92 degrees, anyone slipping into severe hypothermia, goes into the inner sanctum. We rotate the critically ill. The rest of you will survive in this bay, using body heat and insulated gear. Do you understand?" Sheriff Boyd Jenkins, looking ragged and exhausted, nodded heavily. He turned to the crowd. "You heard the man. Form lines. Families with small children and the elderly first." For the next 2 hours, Arthur orchestrated a desperate medical sorting. Using the scanner, he identified the most critical residents. Brenda Hayes, whose lips were entirely blue, was carried inside. Sarah Miller's 6-year-old son, Tommy, who had stopped shivering, a terrifying sign of end-stage hypothermia, was rushed into the 72-degree warmth of the hydroponic bay. Exactly 14 people were admitted behind the secondary airlock. For the 129 people left in the concrete staging bay, Arthur unlocked his shipping containers of emergency supplies. He distributed heavy-duty Coleman sleeping bags, stacks of Mylar space blankets, and boxes of chemical hand warmers. He brought out industrial Katahdin water filters, instructing Sheriff Jenkins to organize a rotation of able-bodied men to shovel snow from the entrance grate to melt for drinking water. Finally, he handed over cases of MREs, meals ready to eat, Sopaco military surplus. "The chemical heaters in these pouches will give you a hot meal," Arthur explained to a bewildered Mayor Hayes, handing him a box. "Share them. You eat 1 meal a day. You huddle together. You do not panic." Hayes looked at the foil packets, then up at the stoic engineer he had spent years mocking. The mayor's arrogance was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, hollow shame. "Arthur, we tried to take this place from you." "Save your breath, Richard," Arthur said flatly, turning back toward the inner airlock. "You're going to need it." The next 3 days dissolved into a grueling psychological and physical endurance test. Outside, the superstorm raged with apocalyptic fury. The anemometers on Arthur's roof registered gusts over 90 miles per hour before the instruments simply froze and snapped off. The town of Oakhaven below them was entirely erased beneath 12 feet of compacted snow and ice. Inside the concrete bay, the survivors established a crude rhythm of existence. They huddled in massive clusters beneath the Mylar blankets, sharing body heat to stave off the damp 54-degree chill. They used 5-gallon buckets lined with heavy contractor bags for sanitation, placing them in the farthest corner of the cavern. The air grew thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and fear. Behind the inner airlock, Arthur worked without sleep. He constantly monitored the Tesla power walls. Because the solar array was completely buried beneath tons of snow, the batteries were not recharging. He had to rely entirely on his deep earth geothermal pumps, shutting off every non-essential system. The hydroponic grow lights went dark. The coffee maker was unplugged. But on the morning of the 6th day, the real crisis struck. It started as a shrill, pulsing klaxon echoing through the inner living quarters. Red emergency lights bathed the steel walls in an angry glow. Arthur sprinted to the environmental control panel. The digital readouts were flashing a terrifying warning. Warning: external air intake compromised. O2 levels dropping. CO2. Concentration: 2,500. ppm and climbing. Arthur's stomach dropped. An avalanche on the upper ridge must have shifted, burying the primary ventilation stack under a solid block of ice. The mechanical scrubbers were choking, unable to pull fresh oxygen into the bunker or expel the toxic carbon dioxide. "What's happening?" Sarah Miller asked, clutching her son as she looked at the flashing red lights. "The intake is blocked," Arthur said, his voice tight. He quickly checked the secondary exhaust systems, but they were already frozen shut. If the CO2 hits 5,000 parts per million, everyone in this inner sanctum will experience severe toxicity. At 40,000, we suffocate. "Can you reverse the fans? Blow the snow out?" Sheriff Jenkins asked, having just rotated inside to check on the critical patients. "It's not snow anymore. It's solid ice," Arthur replied, already pulling his heavy parka from the wall hook. He grabbed a pair of black diamond ice axes and a Petzl climbing harness. "Someone has to go out through the emergency escape hatch, climb 40 feet up the sheer rock face, and physically chip the ice away from the steel grate." Jenkins looked at the heavy gear, then at Arthur. The engineer was strong, but he was nearly 70 years old. Climbing an iced-over granite cliff in a whiteout with 80-mile-per-hour winds was a death sentence for a man half his age. "Put that down, Arthur," Jenkins said, stepping forward and taking the harness from Arthur's hands. "You're the only one who knows how to keep this submarine running. If you die out there, we all die in here." "You don't know the layout of the ridge, Boyd," Arthur argued. "Then draw me a map," Jenkins replied firmly. A local mechanic named David Caldwell, a man who had previously filed 3 noise complaints against Arthur, stepped forward from the doorway of the outer bay. "I'm going with him. I do high-angle tree rigging in the summers. I know how to use an ascender." Arthur looked at the 2 men. There was no time to argue. The CO2 meter had just ticked past 3,200 ppm. People in the inner sanctum were already beginning to complain of severe headaches and lethargy. Arthur strapped the men into the harnesses, equipped them with a heavy-duty Milwaukee M18 cordless heat gun and the ice axes, and led them to the narrow, vertical escape shaft at the rear of the cavern. "Clip into the steel rungs," Arthur instructed, his hand resting on the heavy hatch lever. "The wind is going to try to tear you off the mountain the second you open this. The intake grate is 20 yards directly north. You have 20 minutes before the exposure kills you." Jenkins and Caldwell nodded. They pulled their goggles down. Arthur cranked the wheel. The hatch blew open with explosive force, showering the tunnel with razor-sharp ice crystals. The roar of the blizzard was deafening. Jenkins went first, hauling himself up into the white abyss, followed closely by Caldwell. Inside, Arthur watched the clock. 5 minutes passed. 10 minutes. The CO2 alarm shifted from a pulsing beep to a solid, continuous scream. Brenda Hayes had passed out on the medical cot. Arthur's own vision was beginning to blur at the edges, his chest heaving as his lungs fought for oxygen that wasn't there. 15 minutes. Through the thick walls, Arthur couldn't hear the desperate struggle occurring on the cliff face above. Jenkins blindly swinging the ice axe into solid frost, Caldwell using his body as a shield against the wind to direct the heat gun at the frozen steel mesh. 18 minutes. Arthur slumped against the control panel, his hand resting on the manual override for the main doors. If they failed, he would have to open the bunker to the outside, trading suffocation for freezing to death. He closed his eyes. Suddenly, a massive, shuddering gasp echoed through the ventilation shafts. The heavy industrial fans shrieked as they finally caught clean air. A blast of freezing, oxygen-rich wind exploded from the ceiling vents. The red flashing lights turned green. CO. 2. Concentration. Decreasing. Arthur collapsed to his knees, taking deep, burning breaths of fresh air. 10 minutes later, the escape hatch banged open, and Jenkins and Caldwell tumbled down the shaft, covered head to toe in ice, looking like frozen corpses. They were badly frostbitten, exhausted, and barely conscious, but they were alive. The intake was clear. The mountain had held. The next morning, the dawn of the 7th day, the mechanical howling outside finally ceased. It didn't fade away. It simply stopped, leaving behind a silence so absolute it made people's ears ring. Arthur opened the outer blast door. The staging bay was flooded with blinding, brilliant alpine sunlight reflecting off an endless ocean of pure white. The storm had broken. Later that afternoon, the rhythmic thumping of heavy rotor blades echoed off the granite cliffs. 4 UH-60 Black Hawks from the Colorado Air National Guard descended upon the devastated valley, hovering over the only patch of dark rock visible for miles, the cleared threshold of Arthur Pendleton's sanctuary. As the pararescue men dropped from the hoists, wading through the chest-deep snow to reach the survivors, Mayor Hayes stopped at the threshold. He turned to look back into the cavern. Arthur was standing by his control panel, quietly shutting down the emergency override systems, his face smeared with grease and exhaustion. Hayes didn't say a word. He didn't have to. The look he gave Arthur was one of absolute reverence. The helicopters descended on Oak Haven, finding a town buried in white, but a community forged in stone. Arthur Pendleton never received a formal apology, nor did he ask for one. He simply watched the survivors board the Black Hawks from his mountain threshold. They no longer saw a madman standing in the doorway of a tomb, but a guardian standing at the gates of their salvation.